This is Dr. Cengiz Sisman. Welcome back to our conversations on the humans of the Ottoman Empire. Legend is back. I hope you are all doing well. We are meeting for the fifth time, and I hope that we are going to have many more meetings about various Ottoman figures and personalities and typologies in coming weeks and months, I hope. As you remember from our previous episodes, targeting the general and lay audience, we are having a conversation on human stories in the empire, but also trying to tie their stories to general human experience or common human experience. And we are asking how similar or how dissimilar from other human beings in other parts of the world. Today, we will talk about Ottoman geographers and travelers and perhaps even ambassadors, and try to understand how Ottomans at an imperial or popular level imagined the world. How did they locate themselves and others on the map, on global map? How did they navigate their own lands or even the world? In a time when there was no personal maps or navigation applications on their smartphones. And we will also ask how travelers and ambassadors expanded their knowledge of the world and what kind of maps, if there were any, use in their travels and navigations. So in order to answer these questions and many more, we have a very dear colleague and friend, Dr. Gottfried Hagen, is with us today. He is, as you are going to see today, is one of the few people who could answer these questions very well and make good sense out of them for us. Before we begin, I just would like to say a few things about him. Dr. Hagen received his PhD in Turkish studies from Freie Universität in Berlin, Germany, and he is currently teaching as an assistant professor of Turkish studies at University of Michigan. He teaches a broad range of courses on Turkish, Ottoman, and Islamic culture and history, and he's mainly interested in representations of space, such as geographical writings, travelogues, and maps. And he is very well known for his studies on Katip Çelebi and Evliya Çelebi, who are the two Çelebis, two great intellectuals, two great Ottoman minds from the 17th century, and who is going to probably with us today in our conversation as well. So without further ado, I just would like to invite Dr. Hagen to the podium and then start the conversation on Ottoman geographers, travelers, or anyone who was basically moving or like having a mobility in the empire. But in keeping with the trust of this special talk series, as you remember again from our previous conversations, I would like to ask him about his own experience, his own story, and even more technically, I'll ask him, how he navigated his own career path, long and successful career path, and how he developed an interest into this very subject. And now I just would like to again invite him to say a few things about his own story. Dr. Hagen, please.
Hello, Cengiz, and hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation. It's a great pleasure. I'd be happy to share a little bit of the story and probably share some of my own thoughts about geographers. Maybe we can also get to the point where we can share a few maps.
Sure.
In the course of the conversation. But to start with myself, Cengiz, as in most cases, academic careers are shaped through the confluences of biographical coincidence and some larger cultural factors. So growing up as an expat has probably shaped my interest in places other than where your roots are. I've already written my very first undergraduate paper in a seminar on Imago Mundi, on the image of the world. But I was trained in Islamic studies. So to become an Ottomanist, I was looking around for a good topic. And then coincidence kicked in. I was in a seminar on Arabic accounts of the Crusades. And we were trying to figure out a topographical detail of the city of Antakya. And my professor actually finally resorted to Katib Çelebi's Cihannuma and had the Müteferrika print ordered via ILL. These were the days where you could actually do that. And we read through the passage. It didn't solve our problem, but I said to him, I remember this very well, this is an amazing book. Somebody should re-edit this. And he said, why don't you do it? So that was the starting point. And then as I was sort of getting more serious about the PhD, I found out that the Cihannuma has an amazing textual history that allows us to understand things about knowledge production in the Ottoman Empire that is not as nicely graspable in many other texts. I also found out that geography is a very comprehensive, very capacious type of knowledge. Almost anything can go into it.
Or it can be connected to so many different subjects at the same time.
Right. It's adjacent to almost anything from mathematics to history. So it became a wonderful sort of gateway into intellectual history, in which is largely what I'm trying to do today. So I wrote my dissertation about it. Then I started to try to get away from it. Instead, it kept me busy, and I'm very proud to say that in English, the first English translation of Cihannuma will come out later this year, edited by myself and Robert Dankoff. So finally, we're also putting this out there for a larger audience. Again,
we will talk about this Cihannuma, the book that he's talking about, in a minute, for those who never heard the book before, but it is one of the canonical books in Ottoman cultural history. That is great, and I always say that your PhD is your destiny. In academia, there is no way that you can get away with that. Thank you very much for this nice introduction. Before we get to the more serious questions, I just would like to remind our audience a few other things. We have a QA box and also chat box. If you have any question, please write your questions to Q&A box rather than chat. I mean, in chat, you of course feel free to talk among yourselves, but I would like to see the questions in the QA, and if possible, please make it short so that I can read, if the time allows at the end, I can read them to Dr. Hagen at the end of our conversation. Okay. That's it, and now my next question to our colleague is the very definition of geographers. I mean, we actually chose the title of this talk as geographer, but then we added also travelers and even ambassadors, since they are almost natural allies with these people. But at the same time, one would wonder, was there any category, even like social category, as geographers in the Ottoman Empire? Who were these people? If there were not any, position or profession as such, who were doing the jobs of the geographers of today back in the Ottoman times?
Yeah. So as you hinted at, geography is not a very well designed a very well defined area of knowledge. It comprises many different things. It is also not one of the canonical sciences that were regularly taught in the Ottoman system of higher education. So there isn't a canon of text or a curriculum or anything, which means that the people who write what we today understand or sort of lump together in this genre of geographical literature are a very diverse bunch from very sort of different professional backgrounds. And actually, I should say, they are more defined by the genre in which they write than by what they do for a living. And many of them have also then written other things. So many who we see as a geographer here are a sailor elsewhere or historian or something like that. So it's, and I should say also by the same token, one of the outcomes of this is that we very often have to rely on informations of their texts themselves as the only source about them. Many of them are not in their usual regular life prominent enough to then later show up, say, in biographical dictionaries or so. So to say we have sailors who write maritime handbooks and produce maps. We have diplomats who travel. We have the occasional, so also elite member who ends up in a different, in a foreign place and then has to provide an account of his experiences. We have lower level scholars, ulama. We have scribes like Katib Çelebi, my personal hero.
He's all of our heroes, don't worry.
We have people who come from the palace background, like Evliya Çelebi, who then end up, say, in the retinue of an elite member, a pasha, for instance, and then get to travel this way. There's very, very many different people. And later on, the only people who really do it professionally are diplomats in the sort of from the 18th century forward, who often provide accounts of the places they have been sent to.
So you are basically saying that geographical literature were scattered in so many different works and genres, and there was not necessarily a specific genre of or a profession or discipline rather called geography in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes. So
go ahead.
For instance, we find there is a vast tradition of Islamic geographical literature that the Ottomans eagerly read, and that they sometimes added to by translating, by rewriting, by adding to supplementing into individual works. But that's really distinct from, for instance, the sailing handbook of Piri Reis, or the travel account of Sayyidi Ali Reis, who ended up in India and then had to work his way back. And so these works usually didn't intersect, and they didn't talk to each other. The first person to integrate all of this into a comprehensive view of the world was actually Katib Çelebi in the mid of the 17th century.
Okay, I will actually ask more about that later on. Just let's keep that discussion a bit for the later. Before we get to that, I still would like to understand this, geographical knowledge and its connection to other sciences. I mean, you already mentioned in passing that it is such an interesting discipline that it could be connected to other disciplines. So, did it grow out of other scientific or cultural disciplines in the area and how it is related to, for example, I don't know, geology or I don't know, land register issues and all others, because after all, we are talking about a huge empire, right? Without this geographical knowledge, they would have some hard time, right, to navigate, to imagine their world and to imagine their world within the larger world. So I'm asking basically the connection between geography, quote unquote, geography and other sciences in the empire.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let me talk about two things sort of separately. One is sort of the intellectual traditions that feed into the longer geographical literature. This is on one hand astronomy. That goes back all the way to Ptolemy and to late antiquity, and then sort of gets integrated into Islamic scholarship early on. And the need to determine the position on the globe, the altitude of the stars, and things like that. There's a practical connection to that. Because people needed to know that, for instance, the direction and the times of prayer. That is one dimension of it. Another is what has often been brought together as cosmography, a description of the world as a reflection of the omnipotence of the creator. Very much a religious and edifying and very much a moral enterprise to study this and reflect on the world. So these are all largely world descriptions, right? They're not specific to the Ottoman Empire. But these are the tradition Ottoman geographers were reading and were contributing to. The needs and the orientation of the state are very much a separate instance. And as you're absolutely right, the state needed to know where things are, right? And so the Ottoman administration has this incredible apparatus of keeping track and recording where resources are, where their taxpayers are, and how much they owe. So there's this amazing record of
land registration,
tax registers, right? In the same vein also, some historians, for instance, have added in their works a description of the Ottoman Empire, or have at least tried. The famous case is Celalzade Mustafa, known as Büyük Nişancı, in the mid-16th century, writing an account of Süleyman's reign, who planned to devote the major part of his work to an province by province description of the Ottoman Empire. Instead, he only ended up writing the 30th part, the history. But we know from the planned table of contents what the whole thing was about. So this is also one of the instances where a geographical account of the empire really directly connects to another science, that is history.
Absolutely. That's great. I mean, that really also made me think about, again, the positionality of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, when they imagined themselves in the world, I mean, they were imagining themselves at the center of the world, because, before the modern maps, which were obviously made by the Europeans and colonially backed up maps, where we have Europe at the top and at the center. We had like so many different maps, right? I mean, if you look at the Chinese map, they just position themselves or imagine themselves as being center of the universe, Middle Kingdom, or earlier, Arab maps from 10th, 11th centuries. They envision the world somewhat differently and use different maps, and etc., etc. So I'm just wondering, how the Ottomans were perceiving themselves in this large globe.
I mean, clearly, in an Ottoman worldview, the world centers on Constantinople, on Istanbul, right? And there is a kind of what you could describe as a mental map.
Right.
And
right.
Our colleague Pınar Emiralioğlu has written very interestingly about this, about sort of mentally organizing the world in concentric circles, from the immediately cultural familiar to the sort of outer circle that is sort of more remote but still intelligible, and
right.
then to an outermost zone which is utterly different, strange, populated by monsters, for instance. And we don't often see this directly in maps. We see sort of this progression outwards to the more exotic, stranger, to the more legendary, often in textual accounts. But for instance, when you look at the famous world map by Pirides, right?
Right.
And I'm meaning the first one that he did. There is a trace of this here. Let me try if I can share my screen for a moment.
Sure.
So can you see this?
Yes, I do. I hope everyone can see too.
Okay. So what we have here is a map of the Atlantic. It's only the lower, probably third of a larger world map. You can see part of Africa and South America here. And you see some of the zone of this outer world of inhabited by monsters down here. Some very strange creatures. Can you see? Yeah. That's one of the few instances where this actually makes it onto a graphic description, onto a map. And it's a good reminder that a man who's often sort of celebrated as the great sort of scientific mind, and also has space for this type of legendary and mythical material in his map. So.
Yes, that's again, I was going to ask about that map too. I'll keep my question about that map for a later.
There's more to say.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the most interesting moments in the history of Ottoman cartography, probably. So, like, when they were imagining again themselves and the world, do you see there was any, like, not discrepancy, but any difference between popular imagination and imperial imaginations? Meaning, did the intellectuals or imperial elite had like a more accurate knowledge about the world than the populars, or they more or less share the same ground?
Well, this is a hard question because obviously geography is very much an elite occupation, and so most of the time we don't know much about the geographical consciousness, geographical imagination of the less educated people. There are some, even from rather sort of late periods, there are some rather embarrassing stories about a lack of fundamental geographical knowledge, even among the elite. On the other hand, as far as access to knowledge about distant places within the empire or beyond goes, clearly your ordinary or sort of middle class, regularly educated Ottoman would have access to very little specific information of anything that was going on at a larger distance. And that brings me also to another remark about maps, which is the fact that maps were just really rare in the Ottoman Empire. This is an observation we could see with people like, also even an expert and a great bibliophile like Yatib Çelebi, who when he started to read up about geography, about and try to translate geographical knowledge into maps, was coming up with some really rather crude sketches because he had to create them out of textual knowledge rather than having a model to work from. And clearly not having the training as a geometer to properly create mathematically accurate and systematic maps.
Yeah, again, the accuracy is perhaps not the best word here to use, as you suggested earlier, that we have sketches, and that reminds me of, for example, Matrak Nasuh's drawings, who is the person who was accompanying Suleiman the Magnificent on the way to Iraqi expedition. So we have like a series of almost a photographic or miniature-like or map-like things, but they are not necessarily the maps that we could immediately imagine. That brings me to the question of, again, Ottoman curiosity. I mean, especially their knowledge about the other places beyond their borders. How curious they were, especially I'm curious about now their curiosity about the New World. I mean, were they curious about the other places? Did they want to, I don't know, go there or like, visualize them or draw about them? How was their relation to the, again, places beyond their borders?
So this is an interesting question, and has been sort of discussed in quite different terms over time, right? Yes. So I think you're also referencing the fact that in the past the Ottomans have often been faulted as backward or sort of intellectually inferior for that lack of curiosity. The fact of the matter is, the way we understand it better today, is that there was actually, and I know that I'm in some degree contradicting myself here, that there is a lot of oral knowledge floating around, especially, for instance, in a port city like Istanbul. The problem is, for us today, that it's very often hard to pinpoint it and to track it down, and that the Ottomans were obviously very selective in what made it into written and then canonical texts. So as far as the New World is going, as we've seen on this map from Piri days, he had access to good maps of the New World very early. So this map was done in 1513, and the argument has often been made that he has used a map of Columbus himself that has since been lost. The fact that this is the first preserved map of the modern of the New World that we often read is actually not true, but it's certainly the first Ottoman map that shows it. But after that, the main written source of knowledge that we can track is a description of the New World that was produced out of Spanish and Italian texts late in the 16th century. That's known as the History of the New World, Tarihi Hindi Garbi, or Hadith Nev, the New Report. And there's something very interesting happening here. This text very much has the framework, the structure of a classical Ottoman Islamic cosmography, and then plugs the reports about the conquest and also about sort of the exotic animals of the New World into this framework, and makes it accessible and interesting for the Ottomans in this way.
Just going back to this map a bit, there are so many popular questions or curiosities or takes on that map. You already said that this is not necessarily the first world map. There were others. I think the first one available is from 1503, and this is from 1513, which means that there's not a huge difference between the first available map, world map, and then Piraeus. But you are saying that or your take on this map is that he draw his first and also second. He had also second map, right? They were both submitted to the sultans of the time. You are saying that he draw his map based on most likely the maps which were used by Columbus. That's what you are saying, right?
Or the maps that Columbus drew in the course of as sort of recording his findings and then bringing this back to Spain. The assumption is that a copy of one of those maps has fallen into Piraeus' hand. He says at some point that he had a slave who had been to the New World with Columbus.
So he himself.
So there's a likely connection here. Yeah.
So he himself acknowledges the fact that he had that map, right? It is not an argument, but that's his kind of self report, so to speak, on this map. Yeah. That is again one of the interesting maps for sure that we still make a reference to it today. Very colorful, and one of our actually listeners is asking you to say a bit more about that creature in that map that you already made a reference. Can you say a bit more about that strange being on the map?
Let me go there in a moment. Let me just continue the thread here for a second, which is the question of what Piraeus has expected his patron to do with the map, right? Which is another sort of these fundamental arguments. If he presents a world map like this to the Sultan, what does he expect, right? And historians have argued that in some way it's an argument for Ottoman expansion, that this is kind of the blueprint for future conquest. And there are others like me, for instance, who think that Piraeus is on one hand sort of demonstrating his own skills as a map maker, but is also offering a map here that allows again the Sultan to contemplate the world as a whole, and all the different things that are in it, in a way that is a pictorial cosmography rather than, say, a military planning tool. Okay, and from there, let me go to this creature again for a moment. It's not. So let me zoom in here. Um, so what we see here is an animal that looks like a monkey, but the really mysterious one is this one here, a quasi-human figure with its face, however, on its chest rather than its head, like a separate head, and that's a figure that we find in all the Islamic and also, I believe, in other parts of the world as a mythical creature. So it's not Pirides' own invention. It's him who puts it there on the globe. I'm not aware that that there is any closer connection to this particular place here. And you can also see a unicorn down here, right? So slightly different imagination of the unicorn than we have, where usually we think of it with a straight horn, but this is clearly one.
Okay. We mentioned the way the maps were used in ancient time, not even like in pre-modern time, in a way, in such a way that empires or emperors or rulers used them to exert, in a way, their power and domination too, right? I mean, again, in the case of European maps, we know that European cartographers draw the world map in such a way that, as we said earlier, put Europe at the center and at the top in an inflated manner, showing their imperial ambitions as well as their hegemony and power and domination and etc. So do you see such things in the Ottoman imperial imaginations when it comes to map making? I mean, you already said that, Piri Reis handed his map or submitted his map to the sultans, but besides him, there were other attempts among the Ottoman cartographers to draw maps in such a way that they just wanted to show Ottoman power and domination and hegemony on other places.
No, that's actually, as far as I can see, a much later phenomenon. Right?
All right.
So this idea that you represent the Ottoman Empire cartographically in order to project power and dominance hinges on a notion of the territorial state. Yeah?
Right.
That there is a distinct Ottoman territory that needs to be shown. And that's actually an early modern to modern phenomenon that does not quite capture the realities of even the Ottoman 16th and most, I would say, of the 17th century, where boundaries are in flux. The Ottomans clearly dominate many different territories, but there isn't outside of part of Anatolia and Rumelia, probably, that we could call the core areas. There isn't a sort of an outline that is sort of distinctly the Ottoman Empire, and as a result, sort of a map that shows the Ottoman Empire in its boundaries of the time is actually for the first time produced in the 19th century.
I see.
I can show you one here. A classical example would be this one here. The map of Anatolia from the so-called Atlas-i Jadid, an Ottoman prestige atlas production from 1803. It's actually a translation of an American atlas, but you see in the upper right corner, it says Devlet-i Aliye'nin Asya tarafında olan Memalik. Memaliye. So the territories of the Ottoman Empire in Asia. But that's really one of the first instances that a cartographer decides to do it that way. And so this is sort of the projection of territorial dominance via cartographic images is something that's really late.
Coming late. I mean, in comparison to, of course, Europeans, you are saying that, you know, Ottomans use cartography as a means of showing their dominance is rather late phenomenon.
I mean, producing, can I just say, so to produce textual accounts, of the Ottoman domains, that's a different matter. That's, for instance, largely what Evliya Çelebi is doing, right? So to describe the entirety as wherever he has traveled, and he's traveled almost everywhere, and produce this vast panorama of the diversity and orderliness and complexity of the empire. He does that, but he does not translate this into a map, into a visual map. It's very much sort of a narrative map that he provides us with.
That's an excellent notion for, again, for us like lay readers of this, you know, geography issue, that you are saying that rather than cartographic representation of the empire, Ottomans had more narrative geographical representations of the empire for a long time. That's a great, really a clue for us to understand what was happening there, which means that I would like to ask now a question about then the travelers, Ottoman travelers themselves. I mean, how did they then expand Ottoman knowledge of the world or geography, quote unquote? I mean, what was their contribution to this issue?
Yeah. So travelers is a category we haven't talked much about, and it's again sort of broad and somewhat fuzzy. The first thing to note, I think, is that travel or sort of mobility was very much sort of a shared experience of the Ottoman elite. You know, Qadis were sent to different posts every couple of years. The same happened to military and fiscal administrators. So there were elite households on the move across the empire all the time. Very few of those, however, produced literature out of it. There was not a need to write down what they experienced, and the few exceptions of sort of people who went through this experience, like Evliya Çelebi or Mehmet Aşık from Trabzon, was also in the retinue of an Ottoman pasha, are exceptions. So. But you were probably more asking about travelers who ventured sort of beyond the borders of the empire, right?
Yes, but that also people like Evliya Çelebi, who had been like, you know, traveling, you know, Ottoman Empire and beyond.
Yeah. I mean, Evliya spent his 40 years of travel largely within the Ottoman domains and ventured sort of really from anywhere from the northernmost boundary into the Sudan, and from the Arabian Peninsula to the Adriatic Sea. The few instances where he actually ventured sort of beyond Ottoman territory was on an embassy to Vienna in 1665, and some skirmishes in the northern area of the Black Sea. And probably some parts of his Sudan trip, although there is dispute, was he really there or not? Because Evliya was, after all, a gifted narrator. We should not take all his words seriously. So, but there were others, like we have an account, a description of China from the early 16th century by probably a merchant with also a lot of Sufi leanings, who provided a very detailed account of the Chinese administrative system, and then tried to submit it to Selim I and then to Suleiman. Or Sayyidi Ali Reis's travel from India back home. Interestingly, systematic geographers like Katib Çelebi very much distrusted the travelers. Travelers are people who go to places that are unknown and whose accounts you cannot verify. And so most of the time, when he would try to write this big synthesis of geographical knowledge, for some instances, he had to rely on travelers, like Ali Akbar's account of China. And he was very uncomfortable doing that. So he writes actually a disclaimer saying, I'm not sure how much of this is true, but I'm putting it here and you can believe it or not. So geographers often relied more on older geography rather than travelers.
I see. So that would also mean that they are using, obviously, maps coming from Europe too, right? I mean, it is not that, they are drawing themselves, but apparently they were starting from periods, if not earlier, at their disposals. They had maps, right, coming from different parts of the world, but mainly from Europe.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, maps were rare, but there were some sort of circulating in Istanbul. For instance, Dutch or French atlases, or not French, sorry, Italian, that were brought there. We know of one in, for instance, the position of a prominent member of the ulama aristocracy. Others were actually in the course of the 16th century ordered by the palace itself. There's, and then were probably around. And then comes sort of this a real sort of paradigm shift, if you will, when the Dutch envoy to Constantinople in 1665, I think, or 66, presents the Sultan with the set of the most splendid atlas available on the market at that point, the so-called Blau Atlas, in 11 massive volumes. It's an incredible piece. Hands it to the Sultan over the objections, actually, of some of his Venetian colleagues who thinks he's giving away sort of military secrets. And then over the next course of the next decade, this work gets translated into Ottoman, and then sort of, in a way, sort of shifts the source of knowledge entirely away from the Islamic and Ottoman tradition to Western sources. So this is the translation project known under the name of Ebu Bekir ibn Bekram et Dimishki.
Oh, that's amazing.
Unfortunately, a very much sort of understudied piece of geographical writing. Right now, there's a colleague in Istanbul who's finishing up his dissertation about this, which will be the first major treatment of this incredible enterprise.
Great, that's a great news. But by way of kind of like closing our conversations on Ottoman imaginations of the world and themselves, I wanted to say or talk a bit about Katib Çelebi, your hero, and on his famous book that you have devoted your life on, Cihan-ı-Nima, which could be probably one of the great sources which would tell us how much the Ottoman intellectuals, at least, knew about the world. I mean, can you tell us a bit more on this Cihannuma, and then I'll move to the questions coming from our audience.
Sure. Dr. Chidley is kind of a universal scholar, right? He's interested in everything. He reads voraciously, and he was in a position to assemble.
Sorry, Gottfried, your voice is breaking. Can you just check your mic? Your voice is a bit breaking.
Can you hear me now?
I hear it, but it's just not there. Is this?
I think should be connection here. I should be fine. Can you hear me now?
I do. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So.
Actually, people are saying that I can't hear him. We hear you, but there's this interception. Seems like there's this glitch. It's not clear.
I'm not sure if it. Okay. I see. So my. Okay.
Yeah.
I think this is a side of mine. Let me just try to get and be quite quick.
I'm sorry. I don't know what's happening, but yeah, your voice is a bit glitchy.
So Chidley is interested in everything in his period. He's trying to assemble the available useful knowledge for
Gottfried, I'm sorry. Can you just plug and unplug your mic? Maybe that would help. Still, it's glitching. Sorry, everyone.
Now I'm using the internal mic of the.
Why don't you do that? Just rather than wasting time. Yeah, go ahead like this, please.
Let's go with this.
All right, please.
So Katib Çelebi is almost like a Western Enlightenment figure in the sense that knowledge is the key to not only sort of moral position but also to Ottoman state power. So he sets out to gather all the available knowledge about history, about scholarship. I mean, he writes this incredible encyclopedia of books, that is Kashf al-Zunun. He writes a world history, he writes a biographical dictionary, and in the same context, he organizes that knowledge geographically in a world description. And he starts initially sort of based on the Islamic sources that he has, and very quickly finds out that it's not sufficient. He doesn't have enough information. He breaks off, and then resumes the project with when he gets his hands on a European atlas, the so-called Atlas Minor by the famous geographer Gerhard Mercator. And then starts over, translates that, integrates it with other sources he has. There's some Italian, there's other Islamic sources, and starts to describe the world again. And it's that second attempt that we have recently been describing. Katib Çelebi has traveled himself. He was affiliated with the Ottoman military, but interestingly enough, also his own experience as in that regard doesn't really make it into the book. So it's very much, it's a book science, but he goes about it in a very novel and systematic way. He almost develops something like a questionnaire, a checklist of what items, topics he has to cover for each territory to describe, and compiles this. He mostly copies the new maps from his European source. Do we have time to share one quickly?
Oh, one, yes, why not? Yes, very quickly.
Let me quickly show you this one here. Hold on, I don't see it on my screen now.
We see it, don't worry.
This one.
If you can
yeah.
talk about it.
So he creates now relatively modern maps with gradation, lots of labels copied from Western models. So this is a Mercator map in Ottoman disguise here, and so. But at the key, and I should probably conclude with this, at the key of all of this is a novel argument that he takes from his European sources that hasn't been made in this form in the in Ottoman writing, is that this is also useful for governance. That a king or a ruler needs to know what is where his territory is, where his neighbors are, where the fortresses, the cities, the resources are, in order to defend himself. And this comes very much sort of out of the mid-16th, 17th century experience, when when the Ottomans are at war with Venice, and the Venetians all of a sudden show up in the Dardanelles and threaten Constantinople. And Katib Çelebi says, folks, these guys have better maps. They are better at navigating and orienting themselves on the globe. We have to catch up. So that's the point where that where political agenda also comes into play.
Absolutely. I mean, again, map making or geography in that regard has political, strategic, military, intelligence, connotations all along. And that actually ties to one of the questions one of our audience, Liam Hart, is asking: do we know whether the Ottomans encountered other tradition of geographical studies as the empire expanded? And if so, how did they react to them?
Well, they very much built on the Arabic Islamic geography. And here, so the key moment is the Ottoman expansion into Syria and then Egypt at the beginning of the 16th century. That's the moment that made that whole literature available. And the Ottomans were very good at pilfering libraries and carting books, nice books off to Constantinople. But then the other sort of major part is the encounter with the Mediterranean Portoland tradition. That is one large cartographic and geographical tradition that they interact with. Piri again being the major case in point, but not the only one. And then, the European Dutch or Italian atlas of the 16th century. These are sort of the three major parts. I'm not aware of encounters with, say, Indian or Far Eastern, Asian traditions at all.
Okay, great. We have another question about the conquest of Istanbul by Rosalba Chiampi. Would you say that the conquest of Istanbul, Constantinople, triggered a different need for geographical knowledge? Did they, in a way, change their perception of the world?
In a way, yes. And actually, in several ways. One is that this is the moment that makes the Ottoman enterprise, as we call it, an empire. Right? It's having Constantinople is stepping into also the Byzantine imperial tradition and projecting themselves as an empire at rank, or if not superior to everybody else in the world. And of course, that expansion then leads to a need to control and to survey territory, as was talked about in the context of, say, tax registers, for instance. There is also the fact that a famous episode of the Mehmed the Conqueror, the Sultan who captured Constantinople, being very interested in the works of Ptolemy, right? In those years and reading up. And I think this is again sort of the confluence of both a practical interest in places and creating sort of an image of the world, and a more sort of philosophical immersion into what that means and how it works.
Great. We have one last question about intelligence gathering. Do we know what kind of systematic intelligence gathering of the Ottoman Empire employed outside its border for military purposes? That is the question that you may want to entertain briefly.
That's a tricky question, and I'm not the best person to answer that, but I understand you'll have a guest coming on for that.
Yeah, now you jinx it, but yes, yes, we are going to have a guest who is going to be talking about spies, systematic Ottoman spies,
right,
and intelligence gathering in a few weeks.
Right. So for somebody like me who studies geographical writing, there's very little of a connection there.
Right.
We know the Ottomans ordered Dutch atlases, Ortelius Atlas in the 1570s. Certainly, in order to know, we know that I mentioned the Venetians being concerned that the Ottomans would gain knowledge they shouldn't have from this Dutch atlas. But whatever their informants and spies outside of their borders would convey to the center of power does not make it into the documents I'm working with.
Great. Thank you very much. I mean, we are about to wrap up. I mean, there are so many great takeaway points from our wonderful conversation today. Thank you very much one more time. But some of the, it doesn't hurt like to repeat some of the takeaway points. One, we understood that, Ottomans, at least at the, elite or intellectual level, they knew about the world and about themselves. They did not hesitate to utilize, apparently, maps or done by other cartographers, starting from Piri, if not earlier. We also learned that Ottomans were not into map making so much, rather they wanted to represent their world in written format rather than in drawing. And then we do have like some of like full-fledged Ottoman maps in the 19th century. And I think these are some of the major takeaway points from Dr. Hagen's wonderful conversations with us today. Thank you very much for all the listeners, but my special thanks goes to Dr. Hagen. Thank you very much for taking your time and spending an hour with us. I hope to see you again, and I wish you all the best. I always say to my students, like, be well, stay well, especially in these days. These are very important, important things. And as we already alluded, we are going to have more conversations in the coming weeks on sailors, and then spies, and then corsairs and pirates. So we will be, starting, the Dr. Hagen he has given us a very good framework. He set the stage for the conversations that we are going to have in coming weeks. And thank you very much for everything again.
Yeah, thanks for the lively conversation. Thanks to everybody for the great questions. And
same here.
Good luck with the next parts of this.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.